Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of May of 2024. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates as usually are about Ukraine, but not from the territory of Ukraine. The most important updates are coming from Moscow, from Belarus, from southern Russia. Today the entire Russian, head of government, Putin himself, the Minister of Russian, Defense, the Belousov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, visited Minsk, and they had a very tough and very interesting conversation with the President of Belarus, Alexander Grigorьevich Lukashenko. What were they talking about? Currently, nobody knows. We have, the part where close, negotiations, secret negotiations, and there was an open part when the parties like Putin gave their own statements about the current situation, about many questions, and the most important is that Russia proceeds from the fact that Zelensky legitimacy has ended. Putin, when resuming negotiations with Ukraine, Russia needs to understand with whom it can and should deal when signing documents. This is a very important statement, as you can see. Furthermore, we have reports from the president of Belarus. He also, told us that he doesn't recognize Zelensky as the legal president anymore. So neither president of Belarus nor president of Russia, recognize Zelensky as a, legal president. Furthermore, during that meeting was stated by the president of Belarus that in Ukraine there are enough people who wants to lead the country, both among military and civilian. Zelensky is no longer president, stated by Lukashenko. So, of course, a lot of questions, a lot of things, and probably one of the most important that today also the plane of former Ukrainian President Yanukovych has arrived in Belarus. The media reports that he arrived on an official visit. The last time Yanukovych was in Belarus was in March of 2022 during peace talks in Ukraine. Currently, Russian President Vladimir Putin is visiting Minsk. The new Russian Defense Minister Belousov has also arrived there, was stated by sources. So if you remember, Yanukovych was the president until the until the end of 2013, and after the military coup, after that situation, he escaped from Ukraine to the territory of Russia, and after that, using unconstitutional ways, the opposition in Ukraine captured the power, and after that they started their own elections, and basically NATO and Western countries start running Ukraine. So that was the situation in 2013, and he was the last president, legal president, according to Russia, in the 21st century. So very interesting situation, but what kind of conclusions we can make based on this situation? First of all, we see that the Russians, Russia and Belarus and allies of Russia, first of all, wants to finish the war in Ukraine as soon as possible. The Russians also stated today that they can start negotiations. It's not a problem to start negotiations, but the negotiations should be, started based on the current situation, so that Ukrainians should recognize new Russian borders and the line of combat contact as the current, border between, future Ukraine and future Russia. Furthermore, the base of the upcoming negotiations should be the negotiations that took place in the 2022 in Istanbul. Of course, we understand that neither Zelensky nor the Western countries will agree on that, because I just remind you once again that the words of a very important person of Ukraine, the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, Ruslan Stefanuk, today reported, who questions Zelensky legitimacy is an enemy of the state. So that was the statement of a chairman of the Verkhovna Rada. Imagine yourself, the chairman of, Congress of the United States of America would say, who questions, Biden's legitimacy is an enemy of the state. Can you imagine these words by this person? Nobody in the Western country can imagine these words, reported by the chairman of the Congress or the Senate of the United States of America or the Parliament of the United Kingdom or Bundestag of Germany and many other important government authorities. But in Ukraine it's possible, and Western countries are closing their eyes on this situation. But this is also not the most important. The question is why the Russians are trying to intensify the actions that should lead to the end of the war and conflict in Ukraine. Not the current situation on the line of combat contact, obviously. The biggest problem, and that the Russians suffered right now from Ukrainian side, and they suffer some problems from Ukraine, is that NATO countries and Western countries at some point of the special military operation started resolving their own problems. What does it mean? For example, using the forces of Ukraine, the Western countries started defeating the Russian strategical objects. And from the legal perspective, all these attacks were made by Ukraine. But from real facts, those attacks were made by the Western countries. I'll remind you the first case, let's say with the Nord Stream. According to Russian positions, the Nord Stream was attacked and destroyed by Western countries, not by Ukraine. But according to papers, according to talks and rumors, and many other sources, those attacks on the Nord Stream was made by Ukraine and Ukrainian special forces. But that was probably the simplest case. Let's say, case. Today we got lots of very interesting updates from Russia that I would like to point your attention, because they are the vital question, decisive question that forced the Russians to start acting. First, let's take a look about Crimea. Let's talk about Crimea. On this video, for example, we can see a line of ATACMS missiles that were heading on the territory of Crimea with the purpose to destroy another Russian military object. And later we got the video of explosions, or at least a series of explosions that took place in Crimea. For example, on this video, a local person was managed to capture the moment when ATACMS missiles arrived, and there were very heavy explosions, as you can see. The Russians were trying to bring down some, let's say, ATACMS missiles, but they failed. Most of the ATACMS got the target and managed to deal significant damage. Later, the Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainian, let's say, intelligence provided information, not like intelligence, but those like military summary who tried to investigate and tried to, based on geolocations, try to understand what exactly was happening. According to such pro-Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians were attacking this object. If you ask my opinion, I don't know what this object is responsible for, but most likely this object is responsible for connection with the Russian satellite group, and probably this, let's say, equipment was damaged and destroyed. Of course, from this perspective, we understand that this object has military value for Ukraine, because using satellites, the Russians can control the situation in Ukraine. So, of course, this is the legal target for Ukraine, right? Right, but this is not the last update about the, let's say, damage that NATO managed to deal to Russia using Ukrainian hands. And the most important update is coming from the southern part of Russia, from this area, from the village, from the area in the vicinity of Armavir. So what is this? This is not just the regular buildings. As you can see, these buildings were pretty damaged. As you can see, the Ukrainian drones managed to bypass up to 500 kilometers and to damage these buildings. And you may ask, what is this? What kind of buildings? And according to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, these buildings are responsible to recognize, their main goal is to recognize the nuclear missile launchers. So when United States of America or any other country start, let's say, launching nuclear missiles, these raiders are responsible to discover this as fast as possible. So let's say in few seconds after, let's say, NATO start missile attack on Russia with nuclear weapon, these raiders should recognize these strikes, and the Russians should according to let's say normal logics, the Russians should start counterattack. So, and now this is the question: why the Ukrainians decided to attack the, let's say, raiders that are responsible for this process of recognizing of let's say launches of nuclear weapon? And this question is simple. The Ukrainians don't care about these raiders. The Russians are not going to bomb Ukraine with nuclear weapon, and Ukraine is not going to bomb Russia with nuclear weapons. So basically these raiders doesn't have any value. It's not like a valid target, legal target for Ukraine. But this is a legal target for NATO countries. And this is the most important because Russia understands that this strike, at least this strike, was made by Ukrainians, but by Ukrainian hands. But the, let's say, the order was given not by Ukrainians and not by the officers who are serves in Ukraine army and not even by Zelensky himself. And all the things forced the Russians to be more active. They're forced to stop the war and to finish the war and to let's say break the chain between Ukraine and Western countries, because if the situation continued developing the same way, using Ukrainian hands, Western countries can do a lot of things, a lot of very bad things, and the most important, they are able to reduce the Russian strategical potential, and this is the most dangerous and the most important event during the previous 24-48 hours. Now let's move to the line of combat contact, and let's start from Kharkov direction, where the Russians continue offensive operation. But today, according to information we have, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that Armed Forces of Ukraine began counter-offensive actions in Kharkiv area. So this is exactly what we were talking during the previous days. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians were publishing any updates about the situation, and the entire situation was covered with the fog of war, and just now we got the first report from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. We have also the video from the Russian side. On this, let's say, video, we can see how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions with multiple launch rocket systems in Liptsi. So this is the first video confirming that there are no Russians inside of Liptsi, that Liptsi is under complete Ukrainian control. There are a lot of soldiers inside, and the Russians are bombing this territory, let's say, within a distance. So they are not risk to enter, to move inside. So they try to be very careful, and the Russians are not planning to risk at all. So this is the situation in Liptsi direction. Now let's move to Vovchansk. We have a lot of very interesting updates. As we discussed in the previous videos, the let's say different mappers start updating the maps in the northern part, showing that around 30 or 40% of Vovchansk still remains under Ukrainian control. So this is let's say very important, because a lot of mappers during the previous weeks have colored the territory completely under the Russian control, but we see that the situation is not like this. Once again, the Ukrainians also continue concentration, or have already finished the process of let's say concentration of forces, and most likely they're about to start counterattacks on the Russian positions. And this is very important because Zelensky understands that the game is very, let's say, very tricky, that now he is not recognized anymore by lots of countries in the world as a legal president. I believe China is not planning to recognize him. Russia, Belarus, Putin told that they are not planning to make any negotiations with him. So that's why he needs to keep his value on some level, and to have some value in front of Western countries, he needs to show the results and he needs to show the progress. So obviously the Ukrainians will continue counterattacks in Vovchansk without counting the losses, with the purpose to show the Western countries that they are able to force the Russians to fall back on the line, on the border. And this is exactly what the Ukrainians are planning to do. But the problem is that Ukrainians don't have the Western weapon. At least they don't have enough of Western weapon. Tanks they have, but the Ukrainians have lots of cheap infantry. So the only way how the Ukrainians can, let's say, get any, let's say, objectives on this direction is to concentrate significant number of manpower. And the Russians understand that there are lots of infantry that can be destroyed by FABs and ADAPS bombs. And this is exactly what the Russians are doing on this direction. They discovered the Ukrainian concentration of forces, and when they discovered them, they destroyed. The Ukrainians also suffer significant losses. Every single day, the Ukrainians have around 1,500 losses of manpower every single day after the Russians opened the Kharkiv direction. Now let's move further to the northern Kupiansk area. We have a lot of very interesting updates, and today we have the final confirmation that the Russians captured at least 50% of the village by the name of Berestova. This video was published by the Ukrainian sources On this video we can see how the Ukrainians, as a result of artillery strike or mortar strike or FPV drone strike, managed to destroy the Russian local ammo depot, and we see the secondary detonation. So if there was an ammo depot, that means that the Russians managed to, let's say, move even much further, much deeper inside of the territory of Berestova. So this video confirms that the Russians are pushing, and most likely during the next maybe even hours, or the Ukrainians have already abandoned their positions there. Now let's move further to the south in direction of Bilogorovka. We have some geolocations, and probably we have the geolocations that was published by the Ukrainian sources of the losses and casualties that the Russians had during the Russian offensive operation on Bilogorovka. I'll remind you that according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians, as a result of clashes, managed to establish complete control over the village. This report we got from the Ministry of Defense a few days ago, and today the Ministry of Defense confirmed this piece of information once again. So according to the Ministry of Defense, Bilogorovka fell and under complete Russian control. But today we got some videos from this point of how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions, so we have adjusted the map a little bit, and so showing that possibly maybe the village Bilogorovka is under Russian control, but positions along the Seversky Donetsk river still remain under Ukrainian control. Now let's move further to the south in direction of Chasiv Yar. In this area the Russians continue offensive operation. There are very heavy clashes in the eastern part, and the most interesting that the clashes currently are taking place not even between infantry but between tanks. The tanks on a very short distance are fighting with each other. On this video we can see how the Russians damaged and almost destroyed the Ukrainian tank, and the Ukrainians are showing the video how they managed to discover and to destroy another Russian tank T-90 and another personnel carrier with infantry that were heading on the line of combat contact in the eastern Chasiv Yar. They were stopped by the Ukrainians, probably as a result of FPV drone strike or maybe as a result of anti-tank missile. The Russians continue offensive operation in direction of the forest, towards the forest that located between Seversky Donetsk Donbass Canal and Ivanovska itself. There are very heavy clashes, artillery preparation, but the Ukrainians still hold their positions. We haven't received almost anything interesting from the fields. The Russians probably published the old videos of how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces who were abandoning their positions, but without any changes on the ground, at least geolocated changes that was published either by the Russians or the Ukrainian side. So the clashes continues, the Ukrainians continue abandoning their positions, the Russians are moving further to Canal. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. We have very interesting video from this direction. The Russian sources are saying that during the previous days, the one Ukrainian soldier decided to surrender, and he not just surrendered, he captured the Ukrainian tank and moved on Russian position with Ukrainian tank. So this is the video of when he arrived. He left the tank, raised his hands, the Russians captured him. Of course, the Russians made the necessary, let's say, things with the person, and they managed to get either tank and the Ukrainian soldier. Furthermore, we got the video from the most southwestern part of Vovchansk. The Russian sources published the video of the flag on the most southwestern part of this small village that located along Durna River, which confirms complete Russian control over this territory. Now let's move to Krasnogorovka. The Russian focus is moving further to the north along the Shmita Street, so the Ukrainians slowly, step by step, are moving back. The Ukrainians also are trying to stick as close as possible to the main supply roads, trying to avoid the, let's say, heavy clashes on the line of combat contact, because they understand there are no chances to hold this territory for a very long time. Now let's move to Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka. The Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians managed to capture almost 70% of the village, and pro-Ukrainian, pro-neutral mappers have already updated their maps, showing additional Russian progress in this area. So currently this is approximately the territory that is under complete Russian control. Furthermore, during the previous 24-48 hours, the Russians conducted another offensive operation along this line, and as a result of attack, the Russians captured the Ukrainian position positions, and as a result of attack, few more trenches and network of fortifications were captured by the Russian soldiers. This is probably a very crazy attack, because if you take a look at this video, the Russian personnel carrier was crossing the fields, and the driver and infantry inside of this personnel carrier weren't afraid of minefields or of FPV drones. And this is the crazy thing, significant distance without, let's say, tank preparation, without demining process. And after the Russians reached the point, they landed the infantry and captured another Ukrainian position. So the Russians are moving further to the west with the purpose to get as close as possible to the main supply road, T0524. So this is the main Russian target. The short distance they can do, the less possibilities the Ukrainians in Ugledar are able to have. Now let's move to Staromayorsk and Urozhaine. The Russians continue the clearing operation in Staromayorsk. Probably during the next 2-3 days, the Russians, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, will announce that the village is captured by the Russians, because or some Ukrainians will be encircled and then they will surrender, because the Russians captured the most important, the most valuable positions. From the other side, we continue receiving updates of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces further to the north in direction of Velika Novoselovka, and also the Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian positions in Urozhaine itself. So the situation is the same as it was yesterday, the day before yesterday. The Russians are pushing, the Ukrainians are suffering losses and are forced to fall back. Gulyai-Polye was pretty active during the previous 24 hours. The Russians were hunting and attacking the Ukrainian forces in the area. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian positions, using FABs. So let's look like artillery preparation from the Russian side before another attempt, before another offensive operation, but this time in Gulyai-Polsk direction. Robotyne, we haven't received anything during the previous 24 hours. Kherson direction, just few updates. For example, the Ukrainian sources published the video how they dropped and how they established the Ukrainian flag in the village by the name of Kazachyi Lahiri. So it's like flag game that Ukrainians like to play. They're sending drone, and then using the drone they're dropping the flag on something, on some building, then they show this picture that they managed to establish control over this or that territory, but it was just a drone who was flying above the area. So as you can see, massive escalation, and the most important, that NATO countries, Western countries, starting destroying the Russian strategical and military infrastructure using the hands of Ukraine. And this is a very dangerous process. The Russians understand that they can't counterattack, let's say, military facilities of the Western countries, because according to the legal position of United States of America, it's up to Ukraine to decide who to attack and what objects to attack. So basically, United States of America and NATO countries are not responsible for any attacks on the territory of Russian Federation. And this is the biggest trap that the Russians see. Furthermore, we got a report that probably I forgot to discuss at the beginning, that Ukrainians start considering that very likely, and there are chances that Belarus will join the special military operation and will attack Ukraine from the north. And once again, the real reasons of all these things is to finish the special military operation and stop the Western countries to destroy Russian strategical military infrastructure. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.